The media coverage of President Trump's order on refugees turned sharply negative over the last 24 hours, as some who were already on flights were detained at American airports and protesters descended on JFK. This after the president barred all refugees from entering the U.S. for 120 days to tighten vetting procedures and a 3-month ban on those from 7 predominantly Muslim countries, which Trump said would favor Christian refugees over Muslims. New York Daily News will put it up, published this cover with a weeping Statue of Liberty. And the Huffington Post ran a photo of a dead child on a beach while accusing the president of slamming the door. And this morning, Washington Post banner headline, refugee ban causes chaos nationwide. And at the Capitol, beyond our guests, about 200 protesters are gathering to protest this. So, Guy Benson, the press has to cover this controversial policy and all of its ramifications and whether it was handled correctly and Trump's comments on favoring Christian refugees over Muslims. But isn't this almost exactly what he said he would do during the campaign?
A lot of it is. Now, I agree with you. This has to be covered. It ought to be covered. And some of the coverage has been bad. Some of it has been quite good. There have been some TikToks on how this went down behind the scenes, which I actually find rather alarming. There's also a really good piece by David French in National Review trying to separate fact from fiction of what is actually in the order.
That particular piece talks about how the level of refugees that the Trump administration would admit after this ban is about what it was before the Obama administration.
Right, among other things. There's good things and bad things, but it's a well-reported piece. The one thing that I have been alarmed by and frustrated by watching the coverage and reading it is how many reporters are using the shorthand phrase Muslim ban. Because Trump says it's not a Muslim ban. Look, there are hundreds of millions of Muslims worldwide not affected by this ban, for example, people living in Indonesia, with many non-Muslims who are. So I think that that's a sloppy way of reporting it, although I understand to try to use 1 or 2 words to describe it, it's tempting to say Muslim ban. It just isn't accurate.
Right. He did initially say that during the campaign and then modified it, and now we're seeing the modified version. But when that happened during the campaign, Julie, the entire media establishment said, this is suicidal, he's toast, he's never going to win this nomination. Turned out they were wrong on public sentiment and maybe are missing those in the country now who think this is a good idea?
Oh, there are definitely people in the country. I only need to look at my Twitter feed to know exactly how many people think this is a good idea. I mean, it's certainly, look, he's playing to his base, and he is coming through with the things that he promised he was going to do. The one thing you can't criticize this president for is not doing exactly as he said he was going to do. Having said that, I think to some extent, people in the media and others, including liberals, who thought, okay, well, Donald Trump's not going to be as bad as everybody thinks he's going to be, have now woken up to the fact that he is coming through with his promises. And when you talked about a Muslim ban, when you have Rudy Giuliani yesterday on Jeanine Pirro's show on this network saying, the president asked me to put together a Muslim ban, and this is the best we could come up with. The original intent was, in fact, to have a Muslim ban, according to Rudy Giuliani, and then legally this is all they could go.
You set me up nicely for my question to Aaron, which is, do you think that many journalists, in covering all the things that this president said he was going to do that were controversial, building a wall on the southern border, this immigration ban, temporary, kind of had the feeling that, well, he's saying that in campaign, he's not really going to do it. And so now it's almost like we're covering it for the first time. But again, usually if he didn't do any of these things, the storyline would be president fails to deliver.
He was going to do. Exactly. So in that sense, yeah, you're right. I think a lot of the coverage has been quite good, too, because I think this is forcing so many news organizations to actually go out into the country and see what the impacts of the policies are. And you point out the Post saying that there's chaos nationwide. Well, there is a lot of chaos, and it's important to go cover that.
A fair question is, you know, should there have been a 48-hour notice of this? Because there are people who got on airplanes and then landed at airports in America and were detained. You also have this, TV always has a tendency to find one person who was affected perhaps unfairly and make that person the face of the story. So there's this guy who was an interpreter for the U.S. military, I believe in Iraq, who now finds himself in this sort of a legal limbo. But you say, when you say some of the coverage is good and you've learned things, what about the coverage that you find not so good, and what's your criticism there?
Well, I think that I can understand there's, especially in television, you want good pictures, you want good TV. So people storming airports and picketing, that's good TV. It's not necessarily representative of how most people feel about this. I think what is more important to cover, and there has been some of this, though, so I'm not throwing the whole media under the bus. How did this executive order get written? Why is it so very sloppy in a lot of ways, it seems like? It seems like a lot of the relevant lawyers were not consulted, which I think is sort of crazy. So, and then to your point, and how the media, it's like damned if you do, damned if you don't if you're Trump. You're like, well, look at these countries that aren't on it, like Saudi Arabia and Pakistan. Would anyone making that criticism rescind their criticism if he added 2 more countries to it? I don't think they would. Right. I think you got to figure out what you're picking and choosing. There are legitimate criticisms and there are ones that are sillier.
But I think there were criticisms that, by sheer coincidence, some of the countries that did send terrorists, like 9/11, for example,
right,
were places where the Trump organization has done business and continues to do business, and so as a result, that's potentially why they weren't there. So that could be potentially.
So this morning, Kellyanne Conway and Reince Priebus and Sean Spicer out defending the policy and talking about, you know, part of the concern here is to stop potential terrorists and to tighten the vetting procedures. I didn't hear as many of those voices yesterday, particularly because, as Guy says, there is a tendency to cover the protests, the chaos, as opposed to, you know, newspapers kind of acknowledge that some people actually think this is a good idea.
Well, but you also have people that you talk about who have green cards, who've lived here for years, who are married to American citizens, who have children here and dogs here and jobs here, and they were banned from coming here yesterday. They were left in limbo. There's a woman who has Iranian citizenship who was in Lausanne, Switzerland, who was coming here to do diabetes research at Harvard. She was banned from coming here. So, you know, again, there's a baby with the bathwater mentality here. Of course, the goal for everybody is to prevent terrorism, but you can't ban an entire class of people from doing that.
And when the meeting between the President of Mexico and President Trump, although they did talk on the phone, was canceled because of his statements on building the wall and the complicated formula under which Mexico might or might not reimburse the U.S., I just get the sense there's an underlying tone here that the journalists think that that's a bad idea, that the temporary ban on refugees is a bad idea, and that the tone of the coverage reflects that.
There's no question that the press thinks that a lot of these ideas are bad.
Yeah.
I mean, that's clear.
But that's not our job unless you're an opinion columnist.
Right, that's absolutely right. And I think the president of Mexico obviously was made to be a hero after that.
In his country, at least.
In his country. And the American media then showed that.
All right. Erin McPike, Guy Benson, and Julie Roginski, thanks very much for joining us this summer.
More now on President Trump's executive order barring citizens from 7 mostly Muslim nations from legally entering the U.S. No, those 7 nations include Syria, Iraq, and Iran. But terrorists who have carried out attacks in our country have overwhelmingly come from other places. What's considered the first radical Islamic terrorist attack on our soil, the assassination of Jewish extremist Rabbi Meir Kahane in 1990 in Manhattan. Well, that was carried out by El Sayed Nosair. He was from Egypt, a nation not on the list. He was part of the New Jersey terrorist cell headed up by blind Sheikh Abdurrahman that went on to bomb the World Trade Center in 1993. Rahman, also from Egypt. And, of course, the 9/11 hijackers from Saudi Arabia, a country not on the list. The attempted car bomb in Times Square in 2010 was the work of Fasil Shahzad. He was a U.S. citizen from Pakistan, also a nation not on the list. The New York subway bombing plot, Najibil Azazi. He was a U.S. citizen. He was from Afghanistan, a nation not on the list. The Boston Marathon bombings, the Sonar brothers, of course, Dzhokhar and Tamerlan. Well, they were U.S. citizens from Chechnya and Kyrgyzstan, 2 nations, Russia, not on the list. San Bernardino shooter, Syed Farouk, well, he on the left was born here. His wife, there on the right, Tashia Malik, she was from Pakistan, a country not on the list. The Pulse nightclub killer in Orlando, Omar Mateen, born on Long Island, New York. The suspected Manhattan bomber last fall, who's accused of that, Ahmad Rahmani. He's a U.S. citizen born in Afghanistan, a nation also not on the list. And Tahir Edan, who went on a stabbing spree in St. Cloud, Minnesota at a mall last September. Well, he was of Somali descent, but born in Kenya, not on the list. Ambassador John Bolton joins us now, former U.S. Ambassador to the United Nations, Senior Fellow at the American Enterprise Institute, and a Fox News contributor. Ambassador, do you think this order is a proper method to address the terrorist threat or a haphazard creation that just sown confusion and chaos?
Well, I think it's a step, just to start with the list of 7 countries. This list essentially comes from the Obama administration, which over time had put together a program to reduce the granting of visa waivers to people from those countries applying to come in. So this list of 7 countries is not haphazard. As I say, it comes from the Obama administration. The measure in the executive order obviously takes it a step further by putting a temporary moratorium on granting visas from these 7 countries. And I think the idea that it doesn't address the risks of terrorists coming in from other countries obviously is something that requires attention, because we don't want to be attacked no matter where the people come from. But to say, therefore, this executive order it should be rescinded, is to say, well, if you don't do everything all at once, you can't even address even a part of the problem. And I think that's clearly wrong.
Well, you know, Afghanistan, of course, Pakistan, Saudi Arabia are not included on the list. And the Washington Post is saying that is because the president has business ties to those nations. Why do you think those nations are left off?
You know, I assume that's completely silly. There should be stricter vetting of applicants from a lot of different places. The 7 countries in this executive order are simply, for a brief period of time, going to have a moratorium on granting any applications because of the nature of the chaos or similar circumstances in those countries, like Yemen, for example, which has no effective government, like Libya, like Syria. In the other places, there are governments. Now, that's not to say there shouldn't be very careful vetting of people coming from those countries as well.
What about the critics of this who say, you know, look, these refugees go through 18 months, 2-3 years worth of extreme vetting already. We basically know who they are. There's not a big number, and I see you shaking your head. You know, would you address that concern that they basically know who these people are?
Sure. If they're saying that the visa application process takes a long time, I have no doubt that that's correct. Government is not the world's most efficient creation when it comes to this sort of thing. But that doesn't mean for 18 months FBI agents, DEA agents, Secret Service agents, local police all over the world are studiously investigating each of these applications. It means that for long periods of time, their applications are sitting on somebody's desk. So I don't regard that as evidence of serious vetting. In fact, in this past year, the heads of intelligence and law enforcement agencies have testified several times before Congress that from a number of these countries in particular, we simply don't have adequate vetting. And I think part of this is, on the part of the protesters, is trying to make a political issue out of something that it's not. The fact is, just as you look at people coming in from illegal drug exporting countries differently than you do from someplace like Iceland, when you have countries that are the source of terrorism, you should look carefully at people who want to come into the United States from there. That's not a religious test, it's a terrorism test.
And finally, quickly, what do you think is going to happen?
Well, I think it's going to go on. Look, the court orders, as I read them, are really very limited in scope. I think arguments that could have been made in defense of the executive order don't seem to have been made. There's a lot still to come here, and I have no doubt this executive order will be modified, expanded in some respects, perhaps reduced in some others.
All right, Ambassador. Thank you for your insight and analysis, as always. Good to see you.
Thank you.
Of course.